Awesome. Welcome, everybody. I have the absolute pleasure of introducing our closing keynote speaker today, a very dear friend of mine and a very influential human in the crime disruption ecosystem, Dr. Louise Shelley. And I don't normally do this, but I'm going to read a lot of her bio simply to frame up the amazing work that this human has done, a legend and a mentor to all of us in the crime fighting space. Dr. Shelley is an author, professor. She is based out of George Mason University. Dr. Shelley is a leading expert on the relationship among terrorism, organized crime, and corruption, as well as human trafficking, transnational crime, illicit financial flows, and money laundering. She has authored several books on the subject, most recently Dark Commerce, How a New Illicit Economy is Threatening Our Future. That is a sensational book. It is actually the pivot, the genesis point of our relationship. I read it when it was first published and thought, wow, this is a fascinating human with a breadth of knowledge that the payments ecosystem and the payments community don't have. So I sent Dr. Shelley an email gushing and fangirling and asked politely if she would be able to speak with me about doing a speaking engagement. And in true form, as the crime fighter that she is, all I got was a few call me and her phone number, and that was it. And that began what I hope to be a lifelong friendship with who I think of as one of the coolest crime fighters in our space. Dr. Shelley, I'm going to pass the mic over to you, and thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you donating your time to us.
Well, thank you, Melissa. And Melissa's pretty cool. And the time we finally met in person was my last trip before the pandemic, because we were in Las Vegas, and just about 2 days after that, the world got shut down. And that's the beginning of my talk, is to try and understand what has happened to e-commerce since the start of the pandemic. And but it's not as if I'm just talking to you about what I learned from other people, because as Melissa jokingly says, I'm a crime fighter, and academics can actually be useful in this space, as you'll hear in the following discussion. So I view the e-commerce community as a very important part of the effort to combat transnational crime and illicit trade. And just this week, I was at a meeting of the National Crime Prevention Council where they were convening people working against counterfeiting. And a lot of counterfeit goods are sold online. And I said at the end of it, where is the payment community? You've got to be talking to them. They're an important part of the equation. And that's why I'm really happy to talk to you today, because we're going to see how you can help and how you can save lives. Next. So e-commerce grew in many, many different areas during the pandemic. And I'll talk to you about what me and my team did to combat counterfeit medical protective equipment during the pandemic, because all of it was sold online. There was also a growth of sexual exploitation online in the US and internationally, the rise of counterfeits being sold, the rise of synthetic drug sales, especially fentanyl, which has just kept growing until the last year, where there's been a small decline in deaths from it. And unfortunately, youth in their isolation started buying drugs in larger numbers on social platforms such as Snapchat. And at this meeting of the Crime Prevention Council, there was a mother who set up a foundation for her in the memory of her 14-year-old son, who bought what he thought was a painkiller online, but it was a fentanyl pill, and he died at 14, and he bought it through Snapchat. Next. So let's talk about this. Here you see a mask, and to an untrained eye, if you saw this mask on a website, it says 3M 1860, you'd think you were getting a real medical mask that would protect you during, from COVID. And here you see boxes filled with these masks, shipped mostly by plane to the United States, but literally all over the world. And 3M just was dealing with a massive counterfeiting problem during the pandemic. And if you ask me, what did I do during the pandemic? Me and a few colleagues started doing massive quantitative analysis of websites. And we would get our head start because we had a data sharing partnership with 3M. And they would get reports from their consumer hotline that something didn't look right that they'd bought, and it arrived and seemed to be an inferior product, and they'd call the hotline. And with that would start some of our investigations, and we'd look at who shipped them and where they were bought from. And we developed a whole methodology to do this. And we have and one of the things that I'm greatly proud of is that we would find these masks in warehouses by tracing the supply chains from where they were purchased to where they arrived. And 3M would go to court, authorize a search, get a court to authorize a search. And each time that we were involved in such a process of providing the information, between 700 to over 1 million masks were found. So all of this is going on through e-commerce. And then we would see the literature that came with the sales, and we would analyze that, and we would find some of the criminal networks that were involved in selling the counterfeit masks. Almost all of them came from factories in southern China that had registered at the start of the pandemic and gone into counterfeit medical PPE, even though they might have only had licenses to produce PPE for, ordinary use. Let's go to the next slide. So, as you can see, the end result of this was the seizure. This is an older slide of 55 million masks worldwide. They were seized in Africa, in Europe, in Latin America, but most of all, they were seized here. But as you can see, this is a problem of e-commerce because we help contribute to false or deceptive the removal of over 25,000 false and deceptive social media posts, and over 28,000 fraudulent e-commerce offerings that were removed. And much of this payment was going on through credit cards, because this is not as if we're dealing with some kind of drug where one is trying to obfuscate one's activities. Therefore, this is not going on in cryptocurrency. And therefore, one of the things that you need as e-commerce, as members of the e-commerce community, is to not only exchange information amongst the private sector, but to work with the public sector and to work with academia and work with NGOs. Because 3M kept calling Homeland Security and saying, we've got a problem. But it's so massive, we need people to analyze data. And there was not enough data analysts in the government. So we came to the government and said, we've heard you have a problem. We have a grant from NSF to work on pandemic-related problems. And within 10 days, we had this data sharing agreement. And our research has shown that after this, rates of detection began to increase, and the vaccine began to increase, counterfeit producers exited the market. So it doesn't always mean that you need to lock people up. You've got to be able to disrupt their activity. And that's what we were doing here. To give you another interesting story, there were about 700,000 masks of 3Ms that were or allegedly 3Ms, that were transiting through the airport free trade zone in South Korea on the way to Japan. And a US customs official happened to learn of this and understand that all the masks that were produced by 3M should be heading to the US, and this must be counterfeits. And so he said, let's halt this shipment. They said, but we're here to expedite it. He said, well, just give me a day to find the data. And he sent us the loading information, or sent it to 3M that shared it with us. And we could show that the graphics, there were distinct graphics and mistakes in English that were associated with one criminal network that we had seen associated with prior purchases. And when we could show that data, those 700,000 masks that were intended for medical workers in Japan were then seized and destroyed and lives saved. So this is part of why we need cooperation in the e-commerce space. We can't do it alone. These problems are now so massive, so rapidly growing, that the only way to do this is through cross-sector collaboration. Next slide. So what are we seeing as emerging e-commerce problems post the pandemic? There is now more unintentional purchasing of counterfeit goods. Sometimes they're entering through legitimate supply chains. Sometimes the packaging is so good. Sometimes the fakes are constructed so well that people are not aware that they are purchasing counterfeit goods online. And sometimes when they're selling these superior fakes online, they're charging discounted prices, but still a lot of money for them. So it's not as if you're saying, oh, this is dirt cheap, it has to be a counterfeit. And therefore, they are making huge profits on what they're producing. Unfortunately, pharmaceutical supply chains are increasingly infiltrated with counterfeits and synthetic drugs. This is a problem increasingly in Mexico, but it's also a problem with online pharmacies that are advertising in e-commerce. And I have my exam that I'm giving this coming week is of a case that is about a month old that was just prosecuted, or an indictment was issued by the US Department of Justice against a counterfeit pharmaceutical supply chain in which the drugs were being laced with fentanyl and other harmful synthetic drugs. And so this is something that we're really seeing on a massive scale that hasn't been before. And some of it, this was a very elaborate cross-national operation between the Dominican Republic, the United States, India, and elsewhere. And people were buying these drugs online. One of the things that we're doing research on at our research center now is on fentanyl. And we've been going into diverse websites hosted in China to see who is selling fentanyl. And we have identified over 31,000 websites that are selling fentanyl and other harmful synthetic drugs like nitazenes. And Some of them are being bought by cryptocurrency, but not every purchaser knows how to use cryptocurrency. And so there are cards, MasterCard, Visa, other payment systems that are being used to purchase this fentanyl. Just as this 14-year-old boy who died a few years ago was buying what he thought was medicine, but was instead fentanyl. And what is very interesting is that through this large-scale data analysis, which we can do through finding e-commerce websites and understanding them and categorizing them, we're able to find the same targets that DA finds through its investigations of who are the producers, but the data analysis yields even more producers, many more potential companies that could go out of business or be put out of business by being sanctioned. Why do I say this? Because while the drug problem, the fentanyl that comes into the United States, is now largely produced in Mexico, the precursor chemicals are being produced in China and shipped to Mexico. But it's not as if these chemicals are being produced in underground laboratories in China. That's not the situation. They are being produced in large-scale, legitimate, registered chemical companies where part of the production is legitimate products and part of it are synthetic drugs for export because they receive about a 13% subsidy from the Chinese government to be exported. So if these companies are identified and sanctioned, and that's where the payment community can come in and trying to understand and work with people like us who are pulling down these websites or identifying them, you can do a lot to stop them. Because if they're halted from selling chemicals, and most of their business is selling, large scale chemicals for industry and others, they cannot be functioning in the legitimate international financial market. And at least one of them who's been sanctioned wrote the US government and said, please take us off this list. We're going out of business. Well, that's exactly what we want them to do, is to go out of business. So this is why understanding e-commerce, understanding the financing that goes with e-commerce is very important and very helpful in saving lives, whether it's counterfeit masks, whether it's deadly drugs, or even counterfeit goods such as cosmetics that often contain deadly substances. Next. So what are we seeing as emerging e-commerce platforms, problems? Social media platforms have become larger sellers of dangerous and illicit goods. Some of them are making significant efforts to stem this trade in illicit goods, but some of them are not putting in the resources that are needed. And it's very important to understand how these businesses have transitioned. So one of the things that we've been doing in our research is following what happened to the companies that were producing counterfeit PPE and what happened when the COVID pandemic receded and there wasn't such a deep demand for masks. And our research shows that counterfeit PPE manufacturers have transitioned to counterfeit machine equipment and parts. And as I was hearing at this conference on Wednesday by someone in the auto industry, counterfeit airbags in cars are actually, resulting in deaths on American highways. So if you understand And one does this entirely through studying e-commerce and where the companies have transitioned. You can do a lot to help save lives and the damage that's done by the importation of harmful counterfeits that are come either directly through the mail or through both legitimate and illicit supply chains. Next. So this is the type of advertisement one sees. And these are what we've found in 2024 alone, 31,000 advertisements for fentanyl and other drugs online. Next. So how can you be part of the solution? Sometimes people in government talk about they have a whole of government approach. Sometimes I hear about public-private partnerships. But what I think and what I concluded in dark commerce is that we need a whole of society approach to combating illicit trade. Partnership of government, of the private sector. I presume most of you in my audience are members of the private sector, NGOs, and academia. There are many people that want you as a community to be part of the solution, but they haven't figured out how to reach you, how to engage you. And I think that that's very, very important, because without the insights that you have on how payments for illicit trade are operating, they don't know where to start in their investigations, or if they start, they can sometimes get to the end, but it takes months. Well, you can help, just as we did with this 3M collaboration. When we had their insights, we started being able to contribute to major counterfeit seizures within 2 months. So you can speed up the process enormously. At the moment, law enforcement is facing enormous challenges of trying to figure out what's behind or who's behind cryptocurrency that's being used. I had a speaker in my class who was recently retired from the FBI from a senior position. And he was talking to my class about these marriage scams or romance scams online, and how people, even sophisticated people like a dentist, lost millions and millions of dollars through one of this, they're called pig butchering. So even though we say that sometimes we can trace things through Bitcoin and registries, sometimes there are so many rapid changes in cryptocurrency that one can never find one's money again. There's also trade on the dark web, though I find there's ample illicit trade to study in the open web. And there's trade-based money laundering. And I think that's how a lot of the drugs that are going into Mexico are being paid for. So environmental products, forest trees illegally timbered in Peru were sent to Mexico, and then this is some of our research, and then probably traded to China to pay for precursor chemicals. So these issues are very complex to study and are posing great challenges for law enforcement. Therefore, it's of paramount importance that the payment sector and the e-commerce sector maximize its efficiency in combating illicit trade in the e-commerce environment so that government can focus on the most pernicious perpetrators. And I was talking to a colleague who's been working for a couple years now at one of the major e-commerce platforms, who went there from academia, and he said that at his institution, they collaborated a lot with PayPal to try and understand this illicit trade, because if some sectors become much more transparent, then it is possible to concentrate one's resources in the government in countering this to save American lives on those most pernicious elements of the problem. So in conclusion, I want to say that you can be key actors in saving the lives of your fellow citizens as you help follow the money and secure the payment system for e-commerce. I'm sure there's some questions, and I'd like to hear from you.
Awesome presentation. Thank you for that framework, and thank you for the research and the work that you're doing. It's always wonderful to see academia being effective with a partnership externally that's able to affect the change instead of academia for academia's sake, and it gets lost in the library. So I'm always so thrilled to see tactical movements of illicit goods. There's a question, it's from a couple of slides ago. I didn't want to interrupt you, but the viewer asks, what dangerous trends in e-commerce are you seeing or have you seen emerging due to the war in the Ukraine?
Oh, that's very, very interesting. And tomorrow, I'm leaving for Bulgaria for a meeting of the World Customs Organization, and we're providing insights from our research. And one of them we did was on Ukraine and what has happened. But so one thing that's very interesting is how Russia, which is under sanctions because of the war in Ukraine, has become much more aggressive in its online use of ransomware and its involvement in some areas of e-commerce. And as one specialist who pursues this was explaining to me through his studies of this online, that, I should say, he's not a specialist. He's somebody who has been doing the negotiations of when an organization gets hit with ransomware and their computer systems get locked up. He negotiates with the criminals. And one of the things that he found is that before, they didn't always know who they were hitting. And so, they'd launch a ransomware attack and you get a little police station in Pennsylvania. You might get a hospital, and for a while they swore off medical facilities. But because so many of these criminals in Russia can only operate if they collaborate with the state, they've begun now to launch ransomware against like hospitals in Western Europe and Germany that's taken a very strong stance on Russia against Ukraine. And so as this person reported, in a couple of these cases of ransomware, you've had babies, infants, children die as their medical records or the computer systems are frozen before the ransomware negotiation is completed and the keys to undo the computer systems are opened. And the communication shows that before they, were swearing off causing life-threatening harm, but now the criminals that are serving the state see this as a collateral damage and reprisals against countries, citizens who are collaborating with Ukraine. So that's just an incredibly vivid and tragic example of what's going on in e-commerce. Because ransomware is sold usually through the dark web. It's sold through e-commerce. It's not just criminal organizations, but they also sell their capacities that way. And they can make $25 to $30 million a month through this.
It's incredible. It was in my opening monologue was the discussion of the fraud as a service concept that the bad actor has begun to monetize its toolkit. And that example that you just gave is the criminal actor monetizing their activities for the state now out of an obligation, the state is pressuring them to do it, obviously. It's also fascinating that the bad actor, without state pressure, wasn't a vile entity. It was an opportunistic entity. And now with the state pressure, we have that, well, collateral damage and babies will get harmed, but that's the way it goes in war. That's a heartbreaking example. Heartbreaking example. How are your colleagues in the Ukraine?
They've been bombed. They've fled their homes. Their neighbors have died. Dark commerce is supposed to come out in Ukrainian this fall. It was supposed to have come out. I don't know what's happened now because the person was, there's constant bombing there. But unfortunately, and one of the things that I'm working on now is that there's also a huge illicit commerce going on connected to sanctions busting. And because Russia is cut off for all the spare parts it needs to run its civil aviation, to run its automobiles, because most of the airlines in Russia were leased Boeings and Airbuses, and they can't get the parts for that legally. So there's a huge commerce, part of it an e-commerce, that is leading to huge smuggling of equipment to help keep the economy alive.
That's fascinating. So if we zoom out then and speak directly to the payments people on the phone, in a typical risk matrix scenario, you're looking at your known bads, illegal gambling, illegal adult content, illegal pharmaceuticals. That's what we're trained to think about. We have to now broaden that thought and think about goods that could be going into a sanctioned area. So are you seeing it in partner countries around the sanctioned entity, or are you seeing this globally?
Well, they're global supply chains. So yes, maybe the shipping goes from UAE and Turkey, but they are not, UAE isn't producing the parts that are needed. So they're being procured somewhere else, maybe in Asia, but maybe they're being, how do I say, gotten out of facilities in Europe and then being shipped surreptitiously to these other places, or being requested in smaller quantities so that you get multiple shipments of them. And so there's nothing that, yes, neighboring countries can be taking off points, but one of the largest transshipment points at the moment for spare parts is Gabon, because it had a coup a few months ago, and nobody thinks about Gabon as a key hub of illicit trade. So you just don't know. And you have to look, and if it looks odd and it looks anomalous, then it's worth scratching some more and finding out.
And asking the questions. And I think through today's messaging, the idea that if it's weird, ask a question. And being in the payments money flow, we get to ask those questions. That's weird. What are you doing? We need to empower ourselves to ask those questions. I loved how you touched on the partnership of academia, NGOs, law enforcement, private, government, and consumers. I think we're missing a piece that we need to get consumer accountability brought into our world to understand the consequences of going out and being victimized, which you can't necessarily teach that away. Good victimizers are going to find victims regardless. But if we can start to get people more engaged with the notion of you're willingly stepping into a counterfeit space for whatever motivator, here's the consequences. So I think putting that entire partnership structure together of us combating it, but the consumers to pull out the demand and create that awareness is paramount for success. Paramount for success.
But it's not just that consumers are unwitting. And there's a whole problem of something, we were talking about it in class last night, of what's called dupe culture. And dupe culture is young people who are wanting luxury commodities that they can't afford, and they have no problem buying either counterfeits or knockoffs of them because they want to hurt the corporations that serve the rich. And there's research on this based on what one learns through comments that people enter on e-commerce platforms. And so you'll say, well, this may not be real, or this looks like the real, and let's, get the corporations. And so I think it's important not just following the images of that are posted on e-commerce that sometimes are dead giveaways, but reading the comments of the customers, because there is a consumer revolt going on that is, age of a certain age group that reflects a certain frustration in this country at the moment. And that is being exploited by really criminal counterfeiters. And so they think that the young people, that they're harming the corporate world, but they don't understand that their money is really going into the hands of transnational criminal actors that are exploiting workers and trafficked workers in factories that are producing this stuff.
It's a fascinating discussion, the notion of the threat actor using social media to shift a mindset of a generation to stick it to somebody.
Yes.
When it's an incredible, do you see a path out of that generational dilution of morals, of what it means to engage in a capitalist society? Like, how do we undo this damage?
I mean, this is what I, read as a researcher. It's not what I think about. I mean, that's why there's a need for so many different points of view. And this is one of the big questions that Amazon has been thinking about. Yes, they can go play whack-a-mole from here to next week and next year to get the counterfeits off their website. But how do they deal with this mindset that are ready purchasers of it, and then may not report everything that they see as being counterfeits or dupes because they don't give a damn? And so this becomes a problem for e-platforms that are trying to do the right thing. And it's a very interesting issue.
It is, and you see it a lot with the criminal enterprise, but you also see it with nation state threat actors that want to manipulate the mindset of citizens as well. And I think
Exactly. It's
we've seen
all
it.
the same. I mean, I shouldn't say it's all the same, but it's part of this new culture in e-commerce and the cyber world and social platforms. And it has economic implications with the massive amounts of merchandise that's environmentally unsound, because as I have one mature doctoral student who's working on cosmetics, and they found like horse urine in it as one of the components of it because it's cheap. And so people are really causing grave harm to themselves. But then if the stuff is seized, usually it's just incinerated. And what does that do to the chemicals in the air, or how this is disposed of? And there's just so much of it. Just testing all of it to understand how to safely dispose of it becomes a major issue for our environment and our air.
Completely. Somebody made a joke years ago. One of my friends in my hometown. I'm from a very small town in Eastern Canada, and they were laughing about recycling. And at the time, everybody was still convinced that recycling was actually happening as it was defined. And they're like, "Oh, it's useless. Who cares? It's over there and it's not here." And to which I made the comment, "We live on a ball. Eventually whatever happens over there is going to migrate its way to here. So it's not them and us. It's we live on this ball." I think through partnerships and education and transparency and really, really complicated, painful questions, we can hold the tide back of what we're seeing. I think and I would love your opinion on this. Are we at a place now where we have enough societal awareness that we're making a dent, or is that yet to come? Is it still just academic nerds like us in the background saying, oh no, we need to do something?
I think it's not awareness enough. That's why I heard at this conference on counterfeiting and countering it, uh, a mother who set up a foundation in memory of her son, saying, I knew to make sure my son wasn't watching, explicit sexual material online. I was told to watch for this. I wasn't told to watch whether my son was accessing e-commerce sites for pharmaceuticals. And and so that's one of the things that this foundation is trying to do. But I don't think that there is enough awareness. This is the largest part, counterfeiting is the largest part of transnational crime. And now it's intersecting increasingly in the cyberspace with the second largest one, which is drug trafficking. And then it intersects with the third largest because a lot of the counterfeits are produced by labor trafficking and human trafficking, which is number 3. So we're looking at problems of convergence that have all been expanded by e-commerce. I mean, I use e-commerce all the time. I'm not against it. My sort of, how do I say, academic point of view is to try and make sure that e-commerce is as safe for the community and that people are protected. I saw that there was a question of, how does one see something, how does one protect yourself? How does one identify this if you're in the e-commerce space? So yesterday I had somebody giving a lecture in my class who's doing a dissertation, a former Coast Guard commander, so she's had decades of crime fighting experience. But now she's in cyberspace. So she was showing them pictures of what an advertisement for a real cosmetic looks like and what an advertisement for a bogus one looks like. And the lettering is off and the pictures are off. And so you can rapidly discern the difference. Or the names are sort of hijacking part of the name of the legitimate commodity. And that's where, how do I say, part of our research efforts are done by teaming up with the data analytics program at our university, where some people need research projects. And they have partnerships with all kinds of business organizations. And they're working on this and helping. How do you find the images? How do you use AI? All the things that they're supposed to learn. And so there are ways, you could reach out to your local community that's teaching data analytics and teaching AI and have them sit around and try and figure out what is going wrong in your data space. And it's, with some talent, they're finding things very rapidly. And that gives them skills for them to use in the business world, makes them more marketable. So these are some of the original ways to do this. You can't do this all in-house, or you get an intern from a local college graduate program, pay them something and have them help you.
It's true. The answers are bite-sized pieces, bite-sized pieces. We have to do something, but you don't have to do everything at once, and you don't have to do it yourself. And that's the key to success, is finding out who in your area is doing this. The groups that you are a part of and your academic partners are a part of are desperate for people in the payments community to come in and say,
Yes,
hey, partner, here we go. Now
yes,
you've got both
that's right.
sides.
Yes.
Yeah. And I can't wait. We'll publish some areas where the folks in payments can get to academia. And it's a two-way street. So payments folks, I will tell you now, you're not going to simply show up and vampire out the information, then leave. There is an expectation. It's a two-way street. We share, academia shares. Then we start solving problems. So don't go in thinking academia is going to hand it over and it's a fait accompli. Continuously sharing. Criminals are incentivized. We need to be incentivized to continue to fight them off. And I think we can do it with proper partnering. Dr. Shelley, my friend, we are at time. You are just an awesome human, and thank you for all the work that you do. And I'm so glad we could make our schedules work. I wish you all the luck in Bulgaria. I hope the weather is kind. It can be hit
Yes,
and miss.
so I hope so.
Me too. Me too. I will send you a note in the coming weeks. Hopefully we can get together in person. It's been far too long, my friend.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. And to everybody else, this brings us to the close of another awesome day of awesome content, great friends, great networking, great family members. I am so great that everyone was able to come today. And I said this at the opening, that together we can make a difference. And when we pool our resources, our intelligence, and our strategies, we can create a formidable disruption effort against these global threats. We know this to be true. And I think every speaker that came in and shared their knowledge with us today echoed the same thing. Together we win, together we continue to fight.